Grace lay on the hard floor of their tiny home, her breaths shallow and uneven, each one a struggle that could end at any moment. Mary, her mother, held her hand tightly, tears streaming down her face, her heart hammering with fear. She ran to the dusty village path, calling desperately to a keke driver passing by. "Please, my daughter is dying. Take us to the hospital." The driver slowed for a moment, looked at her, then shook his head and drove off. Mary stumbled back, screaming after him, "Please, someone help my child!" But no one stopped. The village around her carried on as if nothing had happened, eyes turning away. This was her life, carrying every burden alone, while the people who should have shared it turned away. But how did it come to this? Who would stand by her when everyone else looked away? Sit back as we dive into this shocking story. To understand where Mary was on that terrible morning, you must first understand who she was before the weight began to crush her. Mary Adeyemi had come to Irawo Odo as a young bride of 19, following a husband she barely knew to a village she had never seen. She had come with nothing but a wooden box of clothes, a Bible her mother pressed into her hands at the motor park, and the particular brand of stubborn optimism that sustains the children of the poor. Her husband, Lanre, was a soft-spoken man who worked the cassava farm and had a habit of humming to himself while he weeded. She had grown to love him slowly, the way you learn to love a language one word at a time, until one day you realize you are dreaming in it. They had Grace in their 3rd year, and Lanre had wept with joy in the doorway of the clinic, pressing his forehead against the door frame and whispering prayers of gratitude. Grace was, from the first moment, the best thing either of them had ever made. Then Lanre died. A farming accident, a borrowed tractor, a collapsed embankment, a Tuesday afternoon that became the before and after of Mary's life. She was 28, Grace was 6. She did not have the luxury of falling apart. She had a child. In the years that followed, Mary learned to do what the women of Irawo Odo had always done in silence. She managed. She woke before dawn to fetch water from the borehole 2 streets away. She pounded yam with forearms that ached. She mended clothes by lamplight. She grew her own pepper and tomatoes in a small patch behind the house. She sold akara at the roadside on market days. She did all of this with a quiet steadiness that some people admired, some pitied, and some the kind of people who cannot bear to see someone surviving what would have broken them quietly resented. Grace grew and was clever, the kind of child who asked questions that made adults look at each other across her head with widened eyes. She wanted to be a doctor. She told her mother this matter-of-factly one evening as they sat peeling melon seeds by the light of the kerosene lamp, and Mary had simply nodded as though it were already settled, as though the obstacles between a poor girl in Irawo Odo and a medical degree were merely inconveniences to be organized around. "Yes," Mary had said, "you will be a good one." But Grace's body was not as strong as her mind. From childhood she had suffered chest problems, bouts of wheezing that came without warning, that could be triggered by the harmattan dust, by a cold, by nothing at all. The local clinic gave her salbutamol inhalers when they had them, which was not always. Mary kept a careful eye on the supply, rationing puffs like precious currency, always aware that another episode could come. The episode that came that dry season morning was the worst yet. It had begun 3 days before, with a simple cough, the dry, persistent bark that Mary knew to watch. She had given Grace hot water with ginger and lemon, made her sit upright at night, pressed the inhaler to her lips twice, then 3 times a day. But the cough deepened, became wet and rattling, and on the second night Grace had woken in a panic, clutching her chest, eyes wide and terrified. "Mama, I cannot breathe. Mama." Mary had held her through the night, one hand flat on her back, counting the laboured breaths, whispering prayers she wasn't sure she still believed would be answered. By dawn of the 3rd day, Grace's lips had taken on the faint bluish tinge that Mary had seen once before on a neighbour's child, a sight she had never forgotten. That was when she ran. After the keke driver abandoned her on the road, Mary sat in the dust for only a moment before she was on her feet again. Grief could wait, Grace could not. She went first to Mama Bisi, the woman 2 houses down, who had a son with a motorcycle. The son was not home. Mama Bisi stood in her doorway in her sleeping wrapper, arms folded, and told Mary that the boy had gone to Ibadan the night before and she didn't know when he was coming back. There was something in her voice, a flatness, a withholding that suggested this might not be entirely true. But Mary thanked her and moved on. She tried the pharmacy at the edge of the market, a narrow shop with metal bars on the window and a dispenser who sometimes sold medicines on credit to people he trusted. The dispenser was not yet open. The metal shutter was down, a padlock on the latch. Mary pressed her palm against the cold metal and closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She went to the church. Pastor Adeoye was a short, round man who wore pressed shirts and spoke in the booming tones of someone accustomed to being listened to. He received Mary in his parlour, offered her a seat with the elaborate courtesy of a man who has learned that the appearance of generosity is often sufficient. He listened to her story. He shook his head slowly, clicking his teeth. "Sister Mary, this is a matter for prayer. Let us pray together that God will make a way. Pastor, I need a vehicle. I need someone to take my daughter to Dr. Chukwu's clinic before God is the greatest physician," he said, not unkindly, but with a finality that told her the conversation was over. She walked home. On the road back, she passed a group of women sitting outside Iya Ropo's compound, shelling beans in the early heat. She heard her name as she walked by, not called out, but murmured, the way a name is used when it is being discussed rather than addressed. She caught fragments. That woman, always struggling. Maybe if she had married again, her own fault. She did not stop. She had learned long ago that the opinions of the idol were not worth the cost of a response. His full name was Baba Tunde Okanlawan, though no one in Irawo Odo used more than the first syllable. Tunde was 24 years old, the 3rd son of a widowed mother who had sacrificed extravagantly to buy him the keke that was now his livelihood and his pride. He polished it on Sunday mornings. He knew every rattling joint, every idiosyncrasy of its small engine. It was his freedom and his identity rolled into 3 wheels. Tunde was not a cruel man in the way that deliberately cruel men are. He did not set out to harm anyone. But he had grown up in a village where self-preservation was taught early and taught hard, where the maxim was clear, your problem is your problem. He had watched his mother beg and been shamed by it. He had decided, in the unspoken way young men make decisions, that he would never be the one begging. And in the converse logic that such decisions produce, he would also never be the one who stopped for someone else's emergency. He told himself, driving away from the woman screaming in the road, that he did not know her, that he could not afford to get involved, that he had passengers waiting, that it was not his business. The arguments came quickly and fluently, as arguments do when they are there to serve the decision you have already made. Later that morning, sitting at the motor park with a bottle of cold water sweating in his hand, he heard the other drivers talking about a woman who had been running in the road screaming for help. Someone described her. Tunde said nothing. By afternoon, the story had grown in the telling, as village stories do, and Tunde heard a version in which the woman was Mary Adeyemi, whose husband had died on the Oyo Road years ago, whose daughter was sickly. He heard another version in which the daughter was already dead. He heard a third version in which Mary was simply hysterical. Everyone knew that woman was prone to exaggeration, always carrying on about one problem or another. This last version was the one Tunde chose to believe. It was the most comfortable. He went home that evening and ate the dinner his mother had cooked and said nothing about any of it. Her name was Folktale, and she lived directly across from Mary's compound, which meant she had a front row seat to Mary's life, its difficulties, its small dignities, its persistent refusal to collapse. Folake had a husband who drank quietly but steadily, 3 children who were noisy and ordinary, and a secret ambition that she had long since stopped acknowledging even to herself. She had wanted, once, to do something. She had been clever in school. She had won a prize for mathematics in Standard 6. And then life had happened, as it does, and here she was, 41 years old, shelling beans at Ioropo's compound and making remarks about a woman who, she told herself, simply didn't know how to manage. But that morning, watching Mary return from her 3rd failed attempt at finding help, watching her walk home with the particular straightness of a woman who has decided not to let anyone see her break something moved in Folake's chest. She did not act on it. Not yet. Instead, she joined the cluster of women who speculated about Grace's illness. She added her voice to the chorus of those who suggested Mary was exaggerating. She repeated, with some embellishment, the story about how Mary had once refused a neighbour's help, with the implication that Mary was proud, difficult, impossible to assist. She told herself this was just conversation. But something she had seen, the blue tinge of a child's lips, glimpsed briefly through a half-open door, sat in her mind and refused to leave. Grace collapsed. At midday, Mary had come home from her fruitless rounds to find her daughter had slipped from the mattress to the floor, whether from weakness or from the instinct that the floor was cooler than the mattress. She lay on her side, one hand curled beneath her cheek, breathing in the shallow, desperate way of someone who is working very hard to do something that should require no effort at all. Grace, look at Mama. Grace's eyes opened. They were frightened, the pure, uncomplicated fear of a child who cannot understand why her body has become her enemy. Her lips moved. Am I going to die, Mama? Mary sat on the floor beside her daughter and gathered her into her arms, careful, gentle, as though Grace were made of something that might shatter. No, she said, with a certainty she did not feel. You are not going to die. I will not let you. The inhaler was empty. She had used the last dose that morning. Mary laid Grace carefully back on the floor and then did something she had never done before. She stepped out into the village road and wept openly. Not the quiet, private tears she shed at night, but the full-throated, unashamed weeping of a woman at the absolute edge of what she can bear. She stood in the road in front of her house, and she cried, and she called out not to anyone in particular, but to the air itself, to whatever was listening. "Someone help me! Please! My daughter cannot breathe! Someone please!" She heard the sound of a keke approaching. Her heart leapt. It slowed at the corner of the street, and for one delirious second she thought. It was Tunde. He saw her. Their eyes met across the distance of the road. He turned the keke down the other street and was gone. Mary stood in the road, alone. And then she heard a sound behind her, the slap of rubber sandals on hard earth, moving quickly. It was Faux Lake. She had seen Grace through the window. She had seen the child's lips. She had sat for 20 minutes in her parlour, arguing with herself, her hands in her lap, her heart doing the thing it does when it knows the right answer and the mind is still making excuses. Then she had put on her sandals and crossed the road. "My brother has a car," Lake said, breathing hard, not quite meeting Mary's eyes. "He is 2 streets away. I called him. He is coming now. We must carry Grace outside and be ready." Mary looked at her. The 2 women had not spoken in weeks, not since Folake had said something cutting about Mary's Akara being undersized at the market. Mary looked at her and saw the discomfort in her face, the unresolved quality of it, the way a person looks when they have finally done the right thing but are not yet sure they deserve to feel good about it. "Thank you," Mary said simply. Folake's brother, a quiet, serious man named Gabenga, who drove a battered Corolla, arrived in 4 minutes. Between the 2 women, they carried Grace out of the house, Mary cradling her daughter's upper body and Folake supporting her legs, and they placed her carefully in the back seat. Mary climbed in beside her, pulling Grace's head into her lap. "Gabenga, please," was all she said. He drove. The clinic was a 20-minute drive from Irawo Odo, a small, clean building with white walls and a painted red cross above the entrance that had been there since 1987. Dr. Emmanuel Chukwu had been there almost as long. He was a tall man with close-cropped grey at his temples and the particular stillness of someone who has seen enough emergencies not to be panicked by them anymore. He was in the middle of a consultation when Mary came through his door carrying Grace, not correctly, not safely, but with the terrible urgency of a mother who has run out of careful. He took one look at the child and moved. He issued orders without raising his voice. A quality Mary registered distantly as Grace was lifted from her arms and laid on the examination table. Oxygen mask, nebulizer, IV line, hands moving with practiced precision. His nurse, a young woman who seemed to share his quiet efficiency, moved alongside him without being asked. Mary stood at the edge of the room and watched and prayed in the stripped-down way of someone who has spent all their elaborate prayers and is down to the simple ones. Please, please. It took 20 minutes for Grace's breathing to stabilize. 20 minutes that lasted, for Mary, approximately the length of her entire life. When Dr. Chukwu came to stand beside her, his expression was the particular kind of careful that a good doctor wears when the news is serious but not hopeless. "She is stable," he said. She will need to stay here tonight, possibly tomorrow. Her lungs are inflamed. This is a severe asthma attack, more severe than she should be having. She needs better medication, regular checkups. The inhaler she has been using is not sufficient for her condition. Mary nodded, each word landing like something she was adding to a list she had no idea how she would manage. She will be fine, Dr. Chukwu added quietly. Your daughter is strong, so are you. He said it without sentiment, as a simple observation. It was the most generous thing anyone had said to Mary in years. She sat down in the corridor chair, covered her face with her hands, and finally allowed herself to come undone. It began to rain that evening. Irawo Odo did not get rain at this time of year in predictable ways. The storms that came in the dry season's shoulder came suddenly and with temper. By 6 in the evening, the sky had turned the colour of a bruise and the air smelled of oncoming water. By 6:30, the storm had broken sheets of heavy rain, driven sideways by wind, the kind of rain that found the leak in every roof and the gap in every window. Tunde was caught in it on the Oyo Road, about 4 kilometres outside the village, with a passenger in the back, a trader who had been going to the market but was now going nowhere, as the road in front had flooded in a shallow, impassable lake. Tunde had pushed on anyway, as he sometimes did when he thought he knew better than the road. The keke stalled in the middle of the water. The engine, when it got wet, died with a sound like a disappointed sigh. Tunde climbed out into the flood and pushed. The passenger climbed out on the other side, took one look at the situation, retrieved his bags from the storage, and walked away through the rain without a word. Tunde pushed alone. The current was low but sufficient. The keke turned slightly sideways, and one front panel crumpled against a half-submerged culvert. Tunde stood in the floodwater to his shins, rain hammering down on his shoulders, holding the handlebars of his stalled vehicle, and had what might later be identified as a moment of reckoning. He thought about the woman in the road that morning. He thought about how he had driven past her a second time that afternoon, had seen her crying, and had turned down a different street. He thought about these things with a clarity that the comfortable light of morning had not permitted. He stood in the rain for a long time before another driver, a lorry driver going the opposite direction, stopped and helped him push the keke to the side of the road. The lorry driver was a large man with a cheerful voice who did this without being asked, without expecting payment, and without making Tunde feel he deserved the help. It was this, more than the rain or the damage to his keke, that broke through Tunde's careful self-justifications. The next morning, he heard the full story. He heard it at the motor park, where the drivers gathered in the early heat to take tea and argue about football. He heard it from 3 different mouths, which meant by now it was village truth. How Mary's daughter had nearly died, how no one had helped, how some woman had finally taken her to Dr. Chukwu's, how the child was alive because of it. He heard in the telling his own part in the story, the keke driver who had stopped and driven on, not once, but twice. He did not defend himself. He sat with his tea going cold in his hand and said nothing. Later, the other drivers began to talk in the way that village men do when they have decided someone is wrong, not confrontationally, but persistently from every angle, in stories and proverbs and hypotheticals, until the message had been delivered so thoroughly that the recipient had no possible way not to have received it. When Tunde walked home that evening, the keke's crumpled panel covered with a piece of cardboard, carrying the cost of repairs in his head like a stone, he passed the road that led to Mary's house. He stopped at the corner for a long moment. He did not go to her house that day. Some acts of conscience require time to work up to. But he stood at that corner for long enough that the woman sweeping her compound across the way saw him and noted it. Grace came home on the third day, walking carefully, leaning on her mother's arm, with a new set of medications from Dr. Chukwu and a follow-up appointment already scheduled. She looked thin and slightly astonished to be alive, in the way of people who have been seriously ill and have returned from that country to find ordinary things. Sunlight, the smell of cooking, the sound of a neighbour's radio, suddenly miraculous. The village received her return with mixed response. Iyaropo, who had said nothing when Mary was desperate, came to the door with a pot of eba and egusi soup, which she handed over without quite meeting Mary's eyes. Mary accepted it with the grace of someone who understands that people are complicated and that accepting food does not require you to forget the silence. Pastor Adeoye gave a sermon that Sunday that was, by general agreement, aimed very specifically at someone present in the congregation, though he did not say so directly. It was about the Good Samaritan, and he preached it with such feeling that several women wept and one man left early. The women who had gathered to gossip at Iyaropo's compound found, in the days following, that there was less to say about Mary. The woman who had been the subject of their commentary had somehow, by surviving, outrun it. There was quiet respect there. Whether they admitted it or not, the grudging acknowledgement that emerges when someone does something you weren't sure could be done. Folktale came to visit on the 5th day. She brought groundnut oil and a basin of oranges, and she sat in Mary's small parlour for an hour and said little. She asked about Grace's condition. She asked what medicines the girl was taking. At one point, she looked at her hands in her lap and said, quietly, that she was sorry she hadn't come sooner. Mary looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You came when it mattered. That is what I will remember." It was more than Folktale deserved, and she knew it. But Mary had understood something in those 3 days of Grace's illness that she had perhaps only half understood before. That what you choose to do with the moment when it comes is more important than everything that preceded it. Folktale had been small-minded and gossip-prone and had wasted many moments. But at the moment of crisis, she had put on her sandals and crossed the road. That mattered. It counted. Tunde came to Mary's door on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the night of the storm. Mary answered it and found him standing there with his hat in his hands, literally a canvas cap he had removed and was turning in his fingers. He was younger than she had realized, looking at him properly. He had the face of someone who had recently thought hard about something uncomfortable. He did not make a speech. He had clearly prepared one and then abandoned it. "I am sorry," he said. "I drove past you. Twice. I am sorry." Mary looked at him for a long time. She was not, she found, as angry as she might have expected to be. Anger was exhausting, and she had been very tired for a very long time. "My daughter is alive," she said finally. "I will let that be enough." He nodded. He started to turn away, and then turned back. "If you ever need, if there is ever something—" "I know where to find a keke driver," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite warmth, but was perhaps the precursor to it. He put his cap back on and walked away down the road. Mary stood in her doorway for a moment, watching him go, thinking about the strange, crooked paths that people take toward becoming better versions of themselves. She did not know if Tunde would manage it. She did not know if the lesson would hold past the inconvenience of his damaged keke and his public shaming. People are not reliably changed by their reckoning moments. Sometimes the change is real. Sometimes it lasts only as long as the discomfort, and then old habits return, gradually. The way the dry season always comes back after the rains, but sometimes it holds. 6 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in the first cool week of November, Grace Adeyemi sat at the small table in their parlour, doing her schoolwork with the careful concentration she applied to everything that mattered. She was using a new pencil, a gift from Dr. Chukwu, who had a habit of giving his young patients pencils and notebooks on the theory that the future needs every resource it can get. She was studying biology. Mary sat across from her, mending a blouse, glancing up occasionally with the instinct she had developed over 12 years of watching for signs of distress. Grace's breathing was clear, her colour was good. The medications were working. These were facts Mary catalogued every day with a gratitude that had become almost painful in its intensity, the gratitude of someone who has understood viscerally that nothing is guaranteed. "Mama," said Grace, without looking up from her book. "Yes, that day I was sick. The day you took me to Dr. Chukwu. I remember some of it." Mary set down her mending. "What do you remember?" Grace was quiet for a moment, her pencil moving in slow circles on the page. "I remember you talking to me. When I was on the floor and I couldn't breathe properly, you kept talking to me. You kept saying my name." "I did," said Mary. "I think," Grace said carefully, as though she was working out the grammar of something difficult, "that it helped to hear my name. I think it kept me here." Mary looked at her daughter, at her serious, clever face, at the slight shadows still present beneath her eyes, at the pencil moving steadily across the biology page, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You kept yourself here. I just reminded you of your name." Grace considered this. Then she gave a small nod and returned to her work. The November light came through the window at a low angle, golden and unhurried. Outside, the village carried on in its familiar way. A radio playing somewhere, children arguing, a goat making its particular sound. The ordinary world in its ordinary wonder. Mary picked up her mending and found, to her surprise, that she was smiling. Moral lesson: true courage and love are tested in moments of extreme hardship. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next powerful story. We bring you real-life stories of struggle, survival, and triumph that will inspire you, move you, and remind you of the strength within you. Coming up next, we have another incredible story that will leave you speechless. You won't want to miss it. Like this video, drop a comment below and tell us what moment in this story resonated with you the most. Have you or someone you know faced a situation where neighbours or community turned their backs when help was needed most? Share your thoughts. We read every single comment. Remember, you are stronger than you know, and your story matters. See you in the next video. God bless you. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.